We all know how competitive not only applying for low-income housing tax credits is, but of course more than half of the states the last few years have more demand than supply of the tax-exempt bond volume cap for 4% tax credit projects, making it competitive as well. Welcome to BuzzHouse, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can hear all the buzz around multifamily housing, with all the info you need to help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Hi, I'm Don Bernards, the principal in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrick Gibson, a principal at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Let's get started. On the podcast, Garrick and I like to explore newer or trending sources of financing to move affordable housing projects forward. We all know how competitive not only applying for low-income housing tax credits is, but of course more than half of the states the last few years have more demand than supply of the tax-exempt bond volume cap for 4% tax credit projects, making it competitive as well. We've had a couple of episodes over the last year or two talking with attorneys about the why and how for essential function bonds and 501c3 bonds. These are tax-exempt bonds without tax credits that we are seeing housing authorities and nonprofits utilize and be creative with because low-income housing tax credits and volume cap is so scarce. Today, we are very excited to have in the BuzzHouse Peter Sherman, Director of Development for the Housing Authority of the City of Charleston in South Carolina, to dive into a case study of how they decided to pursue general revenue bonds, which we are referring to here as essential function bonds, without tax credits, for the significant renovation of Kiawah Homes. I should note, as part of this repositioning, the project pursued a RAD Section 18 blend, and we believe this is one of the first projects of its kind in the country to utilize this overall strategy. We will talk with Pete about a history of the project, the financing route they were pursuing, and how they switched gears to this product. With that, I'm going to turn over to Garrick to kick things off. Garrick?
Thanks for the intro, Don. And Peter, thanks for being on our podcast. Before we get into some questions for our listeners, please let us know your background and your current role within the Housing Authority.
Thank you, Don and Garrick. Coming to you from the athletic powerhouse of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. We're going to go ahead and forget about what happened last weekend. Chapel Hill, I got my BS in business, and after graduation, went to D.C. for a while and worked for a commercial real estate developer and got my MBA at night. So fast forward about 15 years, got a couple little kids, and that transferred to Charleston, South Carolina, and wanted to pursue a CPA license. So took a job at the Housing Authority of the City of Charleston and been at the Housing Authority for about 20 years now, mostly as the CFO. About 4 years ago, the Housing Authority created a Director of Development position, and I transferred to that position. The last 4 years have been kind of juggling both jobs, because after 15 years as a CFO, sometimes it's tough to get unentrenched from a position. But anyway, so at the Housing Authority for getting close to 20 years.
Thank you for that intro. That's a long time to be at the Housing Authority, and it sounds like you're doing great stuff over there, which is exactly why we have you on here. We want to discuss this specific project in question, Kiawah Homes. And before we get into some specific questions, would you be able to give us some background information on this transaction, like the number of units, the amount and type of rehab you're looking to accomplish on this transaction, and any other key factors of the property?
Sure. Kiawah Homes is in no relation to Kiawah Island, just name only. It's a rather interesting name, but it's our public housing. We've had it since the early 40s. It consists of 61 units, 30 duplexes, one standalone. It's got a community center, all single-story ranch style. About 15 years ago, we put in some significant capital fund dollars on the exteriors. We replaced the siding, we put on some front porches. So the exteriors are in pretty good shape, but the interiors not so much. Interiors really needed to be gutted.
Pete, we know you've been on a financing kind of journey with this project. We know very competitive tax credits and bonds in South Carolina. What was kind of that process? What's that journey looked like before you got to the bond execution?
The journey has been unpleasant, to say the least, where we got into the whole tax credit world at the absolute worst time. So our first application was about 4 years ago. At the same time, the SE Housing introduced the state tax credit. And so there was a flood of applications. And because we're in Charleston and our cost of construction is relatively higher than the rest of the state, our application did not score well. So really the whole concept of a 4% non-competitive tax credit application was chucked out the window because, again, it became competitive. So not successful the first go around. We did not submit an application again the next year. But then we did try it again at year 3, and again, we're not successful.
Pete, kind of shifting gears, right? So you're looking at 4%, like you said, it's just competitive. You have some things going against you just based on high costs. So somewhere along that process, and kind of again, I think it's very innovative, but it's very powerful. You explore the possibility of your housing authority going through the rating process. How did this become an idea, and what was that process like to go through, to get rated as an agency?
The executive director here, Art Milligan, and I are willing to talk to most folks that come into town with different ideas or options to try to get some affordable housing or workforce housing done. So we took a meeting with an investment banker, and he introduced us to these essential function bonds. His concept was not to use these with RAD or Section 18, but to use these to buy other existing market rate housing and utilize our issuer's credit rating to get a favorable interest rate and then be able to convert some of these units to workforce housing. So the concept, of course, was of interest to me. And I remember asking him at the time, why haven't you looked at these for RAD or Section 18? And he didn't really have an answer. He just said that was not something that they had attempted yet. So I talked about it some more with Mr. Milligan, and we decided to move forward with trying to get the credit rating. So we reached out to Standard & Poor's and started the process, which, as one could imagine, is also rather torturous, taxing, challenging, however you want to refer to it. They're going to ask for a lot of information. They ask for your audits, of course. They do an on-site visit. They want to see your units. They want to interview different executive staff members. They give you a pretty detailed questionnaire to complete that covers all the different things such as management and operating data and a financial profile and financial policies. It's a lengthy process, but worthwhile at the end. So it worked out.
Perfect. So you went through this long and arduous process, but you got your rating, right? You got your rating in hand. So now you decide, hey, this is a project, this Kiawah Homes, this is a project you might want to look at utilizing this rating on the bonds for financing this property. So what did this underwriting and timeline look like for you? And, were there any major hurdles that you needed to overcome? And what did the rating help you achieve in that transaction?
So we came out of the process with rating of A+, which we were satisfied with. I've looked at other housing authorities and what they've done, and with the credit rating process, and I've seen a range from AA to BBB. I think around 30 have done it so far. Most of the ratings are of course between the AA and BBB. So either a AA- or A+. So again, we were right there in the middle. So with the A+, we moved forward with trying to get the analysis done to see if it would work with Kiawah. So we reached out to our analysts at Baker Tilly, and they put together a pro forma, and it worked. We had a small gap that we needed to fill, which we were able to do. We reached out to our Charleston County and procured some county ARPA funds, low interest rate, and we utilized a little bit more of our capital fund dollars to get the deal across the finish line. So the actual process of getting to closing is relatively short compared to tax credits, right? It's 3 to 6 months, a lot of lawyers involved. So we would have weekly meetings with, again, our analysts from Baker Tilly, the lawyers, and our investment banker. And we got it to closing as of December 19th of last year. So at closing, we got a rate of 5%. The yield in the bonds 4.85%. So we got about $172,000 premium on around a $15 million bond issuance. An advantage to these essential function bonds is you can get enough in the proceeds to put some dollars in a reserve account. So we were able to do that. And another advantage is there's an interest-only period. So we have interest only for about 3 years at decent reserve account and payments scheduled to be made biannually. So first time for us, of course, going through the process, learned a lot. When we do another issuance, it should be far more streamlined, but really no regrets.
Very good. And Pete, just on that point, like you said, it's your first one. Sounds like there will be a second and maybe a third, but just what's the strategy? Have you thought about the strategy, a similar, repositioning project? Would you look at an acquisition? How do you use the rating? Can you use it too much? I mean, do you have a strategy yet, or just kind of still thinking through it?
Well, currently our strategy is to likely use it again for another renovation project. I don't really know how well this bond issuance would work for a new redevelopment, right? The equity gap is going to be too high. These properties are only going to be able to sustain so much debt. To tear down or redevelop, we found so far is you're going to have to find a different source for that equity. So since we're here in Charleston, we have a lot of old units. I mentioned before that Kiawah was the early 40s. That's not an exception. Most of our units, our public housing units, were built around then. So we'd like to continue to use this for some renovation, and we haven't given up on tax credits. We're getting ready to submit another 9% tax credit application, and we're waiting here for a 4% on some units that I think once we do not get approved for that application, I think it's likely we will switch to essential function bonds.
Very good. Pete, thank you very much for joining us. That's it for this episode of the BuzzHouse, talking with Pete Sherman from the Housing Authority of the City of Charleston and how they utilize these essential functions bonds as part of their repositioning strategy, using a RAD Section 18 blend to achieve a significant level of dollars in the rehab without using tax credits. Once again, I'm Don Bernards.
And I'm Garrick Gibson.
Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. If you have a suggestion for the show, email us at build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD @bakertilly.com. See you next time on BuzzHouse.